Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and the rest of you. The Jolly Scholar 888 here with a Blockchain to Metaverse series. The discussion is discussion number 2, Bitcoin mechanics. The entire series is brought to you by TechnoAnarchism.com and Aurora Smart Technologies. The purpose of this discussion is to give you an overview of how the Bitcoin blockchain, and with that, blockchains in general, actually work. I think that before I can cover why cryptocurrencies are such an important innovation, and why blockchain technologies will become so important in the unfolding era of Web3 and the Metaverse, we all need to have at least a basic understanding of how blockchains operate. Hopefully by the end of this brief presentation, you will have a good idea. There will, of course, be links provided below where you can look deeper if your curiosity compels you. So let's get started. Blockchain mechanics. But first, a brief overview of what was covered in the series introduction. Bitcoin was the first functioning blockchain. But today it is but one blockchain among many and one currency among hundreds. Bitcoin, the digital currency, is generated by the Bitcoin digital blockchain. You might well ask, how is a monetary currency minted purely digitally? That's a fair question, but so is, how is a monetary currency printed out of paper? And these questions will be addressed in due time. But in its simplest terms, the Bitcoin digital blockchain is a digital ledger system. A system that keeps records of all transactions that are processed through it. This is also one fundamental function of any bank. And in the case of a national bank, the bank, in conjunction with the government, will mint or print their own currency. So in the Bitcoin crypto version, there is the Bitcoin blockchain and Bitcoin the currency. The Bitcoin blockchain is the ledger system, a much simplified bank, but with the key component that it is decentralized. No one, no institution owns it. The Bitcoin blockchain mints the Bitcoin currency. But how exactly does this work? So obviously there are not a string of colored cubes moving through your computer. However, if you consider the relationship between geometry, number, mathematical formulas, and digital information, you might see that these cubes are actually not bad representations at all of what a blockchain is. And the blockchain is very simply, it's groups or blocks of information linked to each other. Now, this block of information is a block of transactions on the Bitcoin. And each one has a hash. Now, let's say we're dealing with block number 2. It will contain the previous hash, which is the hash of block number 1. Likewise, number 3 will contain the previous hash of block number 2, and then have its own hash, which will serve as the previous hash for the next block, and so on. So here we have a more detailed diagram. Notice that rather than having a hash number, it's called a nonce, because the nonce becomes the previous hash of the next block. And then the hash of that block becomes the nonce, which is the previous hash of the next block. I look at this as a kind of positive-negative correlation where the nonce becomes the negative, which will attract and pull the positive of the block, say the next block, block 11. So that the previous hash is the nonce, which pulls it. And then it becomes, then the hash of this block becomes like the nonce, which will pull the next block. And it will be called the previous hash. So what we have is a negative, positive, etc., which holds these blocks together. So the hash of this is the nonce of the next block. Now, let's look in more detail at the block itself. We have what's called the text root. In there is also a series of hashes, in this case 0, 1 through 23. And each one of them will have its own text root attached to it. So we'll have a series of representations of really what they are as transactions or potential transactions. It depends on whether or not the block is going to be added to the chain. And we'll get to that. Okay, so now we have a more detailed look. So the hash of block n-2, right? That's what we called a nonce. And it's called a nonce here, which is the hash of n-1, which becomes, in block n, the hash of n-1, which is simply the hash before it. But some kind of transformation happens from hash to nonce. And that's what I'm talking about, the positive-negative arrangement, because this is what will link them. And so there's a linking process that I'm probably as a metaphor looking at as positive, negative, positive, negative. And so it holds the chain together Besides that, there's a timestamp, which keeps the chain in chronological order. And again, the nonce, which is the hash of this chain, it becomes the previous hash of the next one. And then the transaction representation, what we called earlier the text root. It's arranged in something called a Merkle root. That's the arrangement. That's the way that they're arranged among, the information is arranged within the block itself. And again, we have the hashes and we have their text roots. So what we have in this case is hash 01 through 023. Now pay attention to here where we have the text Coinbase. Now you may have heard the name Coinbase because it's also the name of a very popular cryptocurrency exchange. But that's where they took their name from. The Coinbase includes the reward for the miners, which is what we're going to get to in a minute. So the reward in this case, in the Bitcoin blockchain, the reward for the miner that actually adds a block to the chain is 1 Bitcoin. So he's rewarded in a Bitcoin. Now you can imagine that Bitcoin has been as much as 60,000. It's now about 30-something thousand. That's a pretty nice reward. The fees are what is charged to the people actually conducting the transaction, usually at both ends, both the sender and the receiver. Now with that information, we can look at this with a little bit more kind of clarity and knowledge. Otherwise, this looks like nothing. But this is actually a depiction, a kind of flow chart of the blockchain itself. So entity A wants to send so many Bitcoin to entity B. So in the computer, he has the software, and he is now sending, say, 3 Bitcoin. That is immediately put into a representation. It's represented as a block. The block is presented to what is called the network. This network is extremely extensive, and we're going to look at that shortly. But the blockchain broadcasts to every single node in the network, and every single node is every single computer. So all the computers now are verifying the fact that this is a legitimate wallet here. That's what we call wallets, or this computer, this entity is legitimate. It legitimately has 3 Bitcoins. And the entity B is also legitimate and has the capacity to receive 3 Bitcoin. It is then sent off to the miners. Now the miners are simply certain computers of the network. In other words, every computer in the network is a node, but not every node is a miner. So the mining groups amongst themselves will solve a mathematical puzzle. Once the group, say the first, 100 that solve it, there's then a lottery that it's kind of a lottery, not exactly, but it's another mathematical algorithm. We'll select one of them at random. That will be the miner that gets to actually add the block to the blockchain. Now, there's a step that is missing here on this diagram that we're going to see in just a minute. But according to this one, then the block is added, and then B receives the money. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. I like this statement here. There's no single blockchain. It means the blockchain is distributed. The entire blockchain representation occurs at every single node, and you're going to see just how extensive that is. So when we saw that the first transaction, the transaction was initially validated by the entire network, then sent to the miners. And again, these miners are actually part of the network, but they are certain miners that are tasked with solving the mathematical problem and then getting selected. The miners then produce a new block, right? The one that is selected, that solves the problem and gets randomly selected, produces the new block. But that block goes back to the network to be verified. So we have validation and verification before the transaction is actually completed. All right, so now let's look at another flow chart that's a little bit more complete. In this case, entity A is called Rob. Now he scans Laura's address. Right? In the beginning, they didn't have this in the very early days of blockchain. But what would happen is that she would send him her address, and then he would put her address into the formula of when he's filling out his form that he's sending Laura some Bitcoin. Now you can scan it. But either way, he fills the amount, scans her information, and sends it off. Now it enters the blockchain. Sometimes it's called the machine, the virtual machine. The wallet signs the transaction, use Rob's private keys. Now these keys are very important. You lose your keys, and you could lose any amount of money you have in your wallet. So that's a whole uh, that's a whole procedure that everybody who deals with blockchain at all is very familiar with. So you have your private keys. So then it's validated. So again, this is the network here. This is the network, all the computers in the network validating that he is legitimate, he exists, he has so many bitcoins, and she also has a valid address, so that this transaction can in fact take place. It then goes to the miners, exactly as we said. One of the miners finally gets selected to solve they compete to solve the mathematical problem, but only one of them will be randomly selected to actually add a block. Once that block is added, again, the entire system verifies it. Then Laura will see that the first confirmation, and eventually she'll get the Bitcoin. Now, say 6-7 years ago, this could take quite a while. We'll be talking about the limits of Bitcoin, its pros and cons. So now let's take a look at what comprises this global Bitcoin network of nodes. As you can see, it is extensive. And this is after China had thrown all of theirs out, and they just moved a lot of them to places like Uzbekistan and other countries. It really didn't affect the blockchain network at all. It had a brief little slowdown, and then other people picked it up right away. Because as we said, the incentives are very powerful. If Bitcoin is $30,000 and you only mint one of them a year, say you're one of the miners, and every year maybe you get to, you're selected, your computer solved the mathematical problem and you get selected just once a year, that's $30,000 for simply having either one computer or a whole bank of computers sitting around and processing automatically. So it's very lucrative. How many nodes are there? Well, at the time of this survey, it was 10,387 nodes. That's pretty impressive. And this will indicate to you why it is that the blockchain network is so secure, because 10,000 nodes are verifying and validating. And there's a protocol for if there's a problem with the procedure, or if there's an attempt to hack it, which is to produce a false block, a false Bitcoin. It has to reach a certain threshold. It's usually 51%. In this case, would be something like 5,000 or 6,000. You'd have to have more computational power than 5,000 or 6,000 computers, which, as we said earlier, it's easier to simply join the network than it is to try to hack it. After all, if you have the computational power to attempt a 51% attack, you've got the computational power to just sit back and contribute. So once again, we can see how this works. We have the nonce and the hashes, which become, again, like a positive negative that links them together. We have the Merkle root, and we have the Coinbase. The Coinbase of every block designates which miner is going to get the reward and charges the fees to the two entities at each end of the transaction. Now, what do these computers look like? They're not supercomputers, because those would be overkill. Supercomputers do millions of different things. But these computers called Asic miners, and they've become very popular and fairly expensive now. It's an investment to get an Asic miner, and they're so behind production because they're in such big demand that you have to actually get in line to even get one. But as you can see here, this is not a fanciful picture. There are people with entire, like a warehouse just full of miners, all working at Bitcoin, solving Bitcoin problems and processing the chain. So they're called Asic miners. That's the most popular one, and they're the ones that are specifically designed to work the Bitcoin blockchain. And they're now used for other blockchains as well. Now here's an interesting feature. There will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins. The Bitcoins are produced something like one every 10 minutes or something like that. But the algorithm has it so that 21 million Bitcoin will actually never be minted. At that point, the Bitcoin blockchain will run purely on the fees that it charges. It will be much less lucrative for the miners, so we'll see how that works out. But nonetheless, if you've got a system in work and you're getting a constant flow of fees, you'll have say you've got, 20 Bitcoin one of the 20 Asic miners in your garage, and there are people that do that. And yes, they're rather expensive now, but the passive income can make them pay off in a year or so. So let's look at this one more time. You have the initiator, you have the network, which is the nodes. They're also the validators. You have the hashes that are going, the hashes and nonce, the sequence of hash, nonce, hash, nonce. And then you have the miners, which are in fact the same, not the same validators. There's a certain kind of computer that's better at solving the problems than just processing the chain, and those are the miners. And they've invested more money, obviously. And so the miners will then, one of them, they'll compete, and one of them will be selected, and they will propagate the next block. In that block, you'll have the Coinbase, timestamp, the Merkle tree, and the reward and fees. So there'll be fees. The fees are charged to the users at each end. And finally, the recipient will in fact receive the Bitcoin. In discussion number 5, the altcoin explosion, we will see that the new blockchains that have emerged since the advent of the Bitcoin blockchain have much more complicated functions. Functions that can carry out transactions as complicated as any physical bank. And on these blockchains, the coins they mint serve primarily to monetize the many varied functions. Just as a banking system does much more than just print money, store value, and track transactions, these altcoins themselves are integral to the blockchain, but they are not the sole fundamental product. All the new currencies are referred to in general as altcoins, alternative currencies to the grandfather of them all, Bitcoin. The importance of the altcoins for the possibility of creating a completely decentralized financial system, or DeFi, will become apparent. And again, that will be the subject of discussion number 5 of this series. I'll be explaining all of this, blockchain, Bitcoin, DeFi, and altcoins, as we move along. But for the moment, just keep this in mind. Bitcoin is the currency, and the Bitcoin blockchain is a very simplified but efficient bank or ledger. It creates and stores value. And people who own Bitcoin own part of the bank. This is, of course, is very different from the current banking system. Now that you have a good idea of how Bitcoin works, let's make some very superficial comparisons between gold, fiat, and Bitcoin as we conclude this presentation. We don't make any effort to conclude which is better, just simply open the discussion. The Bitcoin bank, the blockchain, mints currency as an integral product of its own transactional processes, its own function. Bitcoin cannot be minted out of thin air. The blockchain can only mint a Bitcoin as a result of work being performed by the blockchain. If there is no work being performed, then there is no Bitcoin being minted. Bitcoin miners and validators are paid by the same process that brings the blockchain into being in the first place. A Bitcoin can only be minted as a result of proof of work. But with the fiat currencies, the government, bank, partnerships can order the printing of money at will, and they supply the money to the banks for lending, paying their employees, administrative costs, customer interest, investors, etc. The only work involved is the printing itself. There were no monetary transactions taking place that were represented by the money that was printed, and there are no limits as to how much money can be printed. And this is just one way that the highly centralized entities can manipulate the currency, as we will see later in the series. Does fiat money have any real value? Does Bitcoin? We will continue to ask these questions as we move along in the series. Could Bitcoin replace gold, and should it? I'm not convinced one way or the other. Gold has real value, and that's why socialist Democrats took us off the gold standard. Gold is not so easy to manipulate if it is the standard of value. There is a limited, but as yet not completely finite, amount of gold, so it is usually anti-inflationary. Maybe it would work better in conjunction with Bitcoin. Who knows? It's too early to tell. Can Bitcoin replace fiat currency? Maybe. But the better question is, should cryptocurrency replace fiat? We would argue for a loud, resounding yes. And we will continue to develop our case as we move through this series. Then you can decide for yourself. It's an open question. So we will leave this discussion with 2 interesting observations. First of all, Bitcoin has never been hacked, which is far more than we can say for the fiat banks. Not that hacking or stealing really matters if all the banks have to do is print more currency out of nowhere. Secondly, it is more lucrative to earn Bitcoin than it is to attempt to falsify it or hack it. If you have enough computer power to falsify a transaction, you have enough to earn legitimately. The anticipated gains for falsifying are too expensive for the effort. Participation and contribution are far more lucrative. This aspect of Bitcoin pushes towards a strategy that I am calling non-oppressibility, a key component of my formulation of technoanarchism. So thank you for watching, and stay tuned for discussion number 3, a brief history of Bitcoin. I think you will find it of great interest because it reveals the intentions that drove the people and communities from which Bitcoin eventually emerged.
Testing.